I'm going to say I practice.
Woodstock.
Okay, we're going to start today with the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. Not many people really know it as that. Most people know this event we're going to talk about simply as Woodstock. And it's arguably the most famous counterculture event of the 1960s. Just about everybody's heard at least of the name Woodstock. And we even have No Woodstock right over there in Tensleep. That's kind of a somewhat tie-off of Woodstock, although it's not really very close. But it has the same concept. We're going to have a music get-together and have a few and keep ourselves under control a little bit better than these people. But anyway, arguably the most famous counterculture event of the 1960s was referred to as Woodstock. It took place in mid-August of 1969. Mid-August of 1969. And it took place in the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York. Okay? So the most famous counterculture event of the 1960s was referred to as Woodstock. The official name was the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. And the event took place in mid-August of 1969, and it took place in the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York. Now, it was estimated by historians that more than 500,000 people attended this event, which included various musical artists who performed for those people that made it to the event. So about 500,000 people drive in on these basically dirt roads into the Catskill Mountains in Bethel, New York to watch this huge music concert. And Woodstock lasts for 3 days. As you can imagine, it got to the point with that many vehicles that you got in, you were in. You weren't getting out. And if you got to a point where you were late, you weren't getting in at all. Have you ever been to somewhere like the Casper Events Center where you got there early and you parked and all of a sudden the game's over and it takes you like forever to get out of the parking lot? Take that times like about 1 million. I mean, these people were packed in there and it started to rain and it got kind of muddy and people were basically there with no way in or out for 3 days. So whatever you had to eat is what you brought with you, if that was your thing, or whatever. And you know, you're in the Catskill Mountains in an area that is not been civilized, and so you can imagine for 3 days what people do during a 3-day period of time. They eat and drink and get rid of the eat and drink, and then they whatever. So it got to be kind of an interesting place. Okay? Now, what they did there is they enjoyed free music from these artists. There was a huge availability of many different types of drugs. So they had access to many types of drugs. Kind of lived the old free life and free sex for 3 days. And I haven't really showed you any pictures, but this is from a book called Life in the 1960s, and this was a pretty typical couple decides they're going to swing up a little bit to the dance, the music at Woodstock, and there you go, his guy and his wife, or girlfriend, or whatever. So it wasn't unusual for you to run around like this at Woodstock. Well, not totally, but not very conservative, right? Now, you can also see from this page, this is kind of what it looked like, the crowd.
Oh my gosh, no.
So you have all these people packed into this area, listening to various artists, etc. You can see in this picture down here that these people are seeking shelter because it rained part of the time at Woodstock. So let me ask you this, is the recipe for disaster there?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you would think that you could have people's lives at risk, people get mad at each other, they get under the influence of LSD or whatever, and they get mad, maybe they're drinking, whatever. The thing that was absolutely amazing about Woodstock is despite all the possible dangers that were there was no violence to be really recorded and no deaths reported. And you got 500,000 people in this place, so I think that's remarkable. I picked this up quite a while ago, but this is an original ticket from the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. It was an unused ticket. It cost you $8 to get in at the time, which is a pretty good amount of money in 1969. Probably 100 or so now, or maybe more. I don't know, I'd have to look. But it was scheduled to start at 10 a.m. on August 15th, 1969, and no refunds and whatever. I don't know if anybody was there collecting these, to be honest with you. It got kind of crazy, but I'll pass it around. That is an original Woodstock ticket. Unused, nobody used it, they didn't sell it, but it was one that was printed. But it was probably the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, without doubt, the most famous counterculture event of the 60s. It was funny because when I was at Minico High School in Rupert, Idaho, I was a young administrator. I was 28 years old. And one of the English teachers there, a guy, had been to Woodstock. And he and I talked, and he would always come into the class and tell about his experiences at Woodstock. And he said it was crazy that nobody ended up dead or ended up, you know, hurt badly or whatever, okay? All right, that then will take us to the dangers of the counterculture movement in America. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you out front that historians believe that this counterculture movement in America was a very, very dangerous time in American history, and we're still paying for it today. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why historians believe that the counterculture movement was one of the most dangerous times in American history. I'm also going to try and explain to you, and part of it's my own bias, of why what happened in the 1960s still affects us today. Okay? Your first reason, according to historians, that the counterculture movement in America was a dangerous time in our history is it promoted self-destruction. It promoted self-destruction. What might I mean by the counterculture movement promoted self-destruction? Well, would be more specific. Because of drugs, what happened, for example? Yeah, but because of that, what happened? Because of that, what happened? What? Who said it?
Destruction.
What did you say?
I said that.
Death. The point of this whole thing of it promoted self-destruction is many, many young lives were either lost because of death or ruined forever. Many lives of the American youth were either lost through death or their lives were ruined or never the same. I'll give you an example. I won't say who, but we have a person in town, an elderly person and his wife, whose daughter got caught up in this thing in the 1960s, right here from Orland, Wyoming, who went back east and got herself in a bad, bad situation to the point where the parents had to go get her and bring her back. And the girl is probably 60 years old, or no more than that, probably 65, 70 years old right now, and she has never, ever amounted to much, to be honest with you. Struggled with addiction, struggled with everything because of the choices she made in the 1960s. It's an interesting story. So the first danger is it promoted self-destruction. Many young lives were either lost or ruined because of that movement. The second one is it increased social hostility across the United States. It increased social hostility across the United States. What is social hostility, by the way? Anybody know what that is? What? Kind of. Social hostility would be hostility between what? Social classes. Okay? When something like this happens that people see as negative, the counterculture movement, they start pointing fingers. And they start pointing fingers at whose fault it is. Well, it's that doggone upper class's fault. No, it's the middle class's fault. No, it's the upper middle class's fault. No, it's the lower middle class's fault. No, it's the lower people's fault, class people's fault. What's the only social class that can take absolutely no responsibility for the counterculture movement? The lower class. But who do you think gets the most blame for it? The lower class. So what happened is classes started pointing fingers at each other on whose fault the counterculture movement was, and it separated people in this country, okay? Because the social classes didn't get along with each other because they were blaming each other for the counterculture movement. So it increased social hostility across the United States. The third one is what I think the most important one. I think it more than what deals with the problems we have today. And this third example of why the counterculture was so bad as far as this country's history is it was simply bad in view of human nature. The counterculture movement was simply bad in view of human nature. Simply bad in view of human nature. What does that mean? Yeah, I mean, it was not the norm. It was simply bad in the view of human nature. Human nature thought this behavior in the 60s was not appropriate. And people thought that. I'm going to give you some examples, and I just kind of want you, listen, because I think you'll get better by listening. I think there's no question that problems that we have in society today were created as a result of the counterculture movement. And I'm going to give you an example. I told you that the now generation did not study the four cores. They did not put in any emphasis in subjects that would get them ahead in life, good jobs. Now let's look at the domino effect. So, if you were a parent in the or a kid in the 1960s, and you could care less about math, science, English, or social studies, and you were more into mythology and astrology and religion, when you had kids, what do you think your attitude towards that was with them? The same. And when they had kids, the same. And when they had kids, the same. And who are those kids now? You. I mean, you see what I'm saying? And so if your parents didn't care about the four cores, and their parents didn't care about the four cores, and their parents didn't care about the four cores, what does that lead to in America that we have as a problem today? Don't study what you're supposed to, can't get a good job. Don't study what you're supposed to, can't get a good job. Can't get a good job, can't get a job, which leads to the problem of unemployment. So I really believe that the problems that we have in unemployment today stem from people that do not understand the importance of a good education so you can get a good job. Now, are there people that are unemployed that aren't in that boat? Yes. But on the other hand, I don't think that the thought process of not studying core subject areas has helped our country today. Okay? Now, here's another one I want to ask you about. What kind of pressure are we under as teachers in this school every single day for about the last 3 or 4 years? Graduation. By God, we got to give diplomas away because our graduation rate's got to be up. Well, where do you think that started? Where do you think people quit not graduating from high school? I think if you look at the decades prior to the 60s, most people graduated from high school. It wasn't that difficult, okay? Of course, the requirements were different. And then you go back to the Depression, and maybe people didn't graduate because they had to work. So there's tough. But I'm telling you, this graduation rate problem didn't start 3 years ago at Warland High School, right? All of a sudden we care about it, and so we do those types of things. I got to tell you, when I was in high school in the mid-'70s, nobody gave a rat's rear end about graduation. And this isn't probably right, but here's the difference. So Bob Clark, matter of fact, I have a picture of Bob Clark back there underneath the flag, he and I. He was my guidance counselor in high school. And we often talk about the old days, in which, back in the old days, you'd bring a kid in, you'd say, Charles, you haven't been coming to school, your grades are terrible, which isn't obviously true. You're a bad student, you're in trouble all the time. I got a couple options for you. I think the U.S. Army could use you. And then that's where that kid was guided. We didn't care about graduation rate, we tried to get him into something. Well, now you can't get in the military without a high school diploma. It's a whole different game. Then he'd say, if Charles wasn't military material in the counselor's mind, he'd say, Charles, Otto Bendewall down there at the Standard gas station's hiring, looking for a grease monkey, change oil, pump gas. How about if you go down there? I'll tell you what, I'll call him. You can just go ahead and go down there and see if he'll give you a job. So Charles would run down to Otto's, and Otto would say, yeah, I could use a grease monkey and a gas thing. And Charles would be down there the next 30 years. That's what Charles would do. And so we didn't worry about graduation rates so much in those days. We worried about getting you out into life and doing something. So was that bad that Charles went down and worked at Otto's Bendewall's Standard Station for 30 years? Probably not. He put food on his family, food on the plate for his family and went on, right? Whatever. But I'm just saying, the whole thing is a lot different now. Now we got to get you out, and you all got to qualify for halfway, and you all got to go to college, and you all got, it just doesn't work. Life doesn't work like that. And I think this whole thing started back down in the 1960s when we started worrying about graduation rates. How about this? What is our attitude today about the American government? Bad. Yeah, we don't trust the government at all, right? Now, it was kind of interesting because back in I got to think about this. About 1990, I was very fortunate to have a world-famous author by the name of Stephen Ambrose come and visit my honors history class because he was interested in Western history, like the history of Fort Bend, Montana. If you don't know that, if you knew it, you'd know why you'd be there. Anyway, he just shows up Googling. Google Stephen Ambrose. He's wrote world-famous books about World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, Lewis and Clark, I mean, Crazy Horse and Custer, you can go on and on. Anyway, he came to visit my class. And we were talking about this, and it just struck me. He said, you know, we have lost our minds on our feelings towards government. He said, in 1950 or 1956, when Dwight Eisenhower said something, everybody believed it was the gospel truth, respected his opinion, and he was the President of the United States. He said, even by the early 60s with Kennedy, people pretty much respected the office of the presidency. But he said, once Kennedy was assassinated, from that point on, with our rejection towards leadership and we don't like authority, he said our attitudes toward the government have been just terrible, and they've disintegrated to a point of no return. You never would have referred to the president in 1950 as Trump or Obama or Bush. They'd have been President Trump, President Obama, President Bush. Okay? You would never have referred to teachers as Durr or Lawton or O'Callahan, Mr. or Mrs. That's kind of how it was. In the old days, we used to say, when I first started teaching, we would hope that we would say to kids, we want you to treat your teachers with the same respect that you would treat your parents. God forbid we would say that today. I mean, you'd be actually putting yourself in a worse situation. So the point is, these attitudes towards authority, and these attitudes towards the government, and these attitudes regarding education and teachers have disintegrated tremendously since the 1960s, and I often blame the 1960s for the attitudes that have been passed down through generations. Education, just, I mean, people don't respect that. Teachers aren't respected, and I get there's probably some that don't deserve it, but for the most part, you know, I'll tell you a quick story. I don't like to waste a lot of time. Ever tell you the Tim Schlinwald story? I got in trouble in high school with that. Well, I was not perfect, but I was pretty good. So, we had this teacher named Tim Schlinwald, and he was a math teacher. I've told you my philosophy of math before. But anyway, so I'm in his math class, and we had it right after lunch. And this guy was real tall, big guy, and I thought he was kind of a dope. I mean, I didn't really like him, but I didn't say it. But you know, you have teachers you like him. He was kind of one of those guys. In those days, we had chalkboards. And you had a tray just like this, and you had chalk. And Mr. Schlinwald used to always come in late after lunch. Every day, 5 minutes late. So the kids would already be there, and he'd come in. And he'd start, and the first thing he'd do is go to his chalkboard, and there wouldn't be any chalk there. He'd just get mad. Mad. Because what we would do, some of us, is we would take the chalk off his chalkboard and hide it. So every day, because we were kind of frustrated, he came late all the time. So every day he'd have to go get another 2 or 3 pieces of chalk, and it just irritated me. And then he came up with this chalk holder. He had this really fancy chalk holder that you put the chalk in, and then you wouldn't have to worry about getting it on your hands, because you know. And he had so when he'd leave that there, then we'd hide it too. So he was never happy. So anyway, one day I come in a little bit late, but I beat him in there. And you remember those desks when you were in elementary that had the indentation you could put your pencils in? Went all the way across, right? Pretty cool, right? Well, I hurry up and sit down about where Carla would. That was about my desk. Comparison. And I get in there and beat him in here. Look down, there's like 9 pieces of chalk on my desk in these holders. I look over at my buddy Sam Stokey, who's my dentist, and he's got this look on his face like, all right, let's see what's going to happen here. And I'm thinking, well, I'll be okay. Because, I mean, nobody's going to steal the chalk off the teacher's desk and then put it on theirs. I mean, so he's going to figure out it wasn't me. He walks in, must have been a worse day than normal. No chalk, turns around. He comes over, grabs me out of the desk, takes me outside, opens the door, boom, 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 boom against the lockers about as hard as he can. Now, am I strong enough or athletic enough to give him some business? Well, sure, but that isn't how I was brought up. You know, you respect your teachers. So even though I'm going, I'm just kind of taking it. And then he says to me, you're not getting back in my class until you eat every piece of that chalk. No, I'm not making this up. This isn't one of these catch jokes. Well, that wasn't going to work for me, right? So I go over the next day, instead of go to class, I go to the library. And Mrs. Dorothy Tadson's librarian, she really likes me. think she kind of had a crush on me. But she was an older gal. But anyway, she kind of like. But anyway, she actually came to my wedding when I got married in New Orleans. She was about 90.
She was
I object.
Yeah, she brought him. But anyway, this is on tape. But anyway, she comes to my rescue and she says, "Well, you can just stay in here. You know, he's kind of a hothead. He'll settle down and he'll let you back in. But you can stay here for a couple of days. You can." Okay, well, great. Read Hot Rod magazine, Sports Illustrated. It's all good. About the fourth day I'm in there, Mrs. Tadson comes up to me and she says, "Well, I can't have you anymore in here. Mr. Schlenbolt got after me and chewed me out. You're gonna have to go down and talk to Mr. Clark, his counselor." And I didn't want to really, but I thought, whatever. So I liked him, so I went down and I said, "So he told me, I told him the story. He goes, "Oh geez," he says, "Here's what you do." He says, "You know, the guy is how he is." He says, I know you probably didn't do it. Just go down and tell him you did it. Tell him you're sorry. You'll never do it again. He'll let you back in class. You just gotta suck it up." And that was kind of hard for a 16-year-old kid to do, is walk down there and admit to something you didn't do. So, all right, I think it's better to get my dad involved. That's where I'm going on this thing, right? So I go down there and Mr. Schlembolt, "Jim, sorry, I should have taken your chalk, which I didn't. I should have taken your chalk, and I'm sorry, and I'd like to get back to class." He says, "No." He says, "You're not getting in this class until you eat every one of those pieces of chalk. I got it right here for you." Okay. So I run down to Mr. Clark, and I tell him, he goes, "You're going to have to get your dad to go up there." He says, "No way. No way I'm bringing my dad up here. First of all, he ain't going to believe me. And second of all, he's not going to take off work to come, lose money to come down to, I'm not doing it." He says, "It's the only way you're getting back in, you got to get back in there. If you don't call your dad, I'm going to call him." I said, okay. So I go home and tell my dad this story. Well, his first comment is he doesn't believe me. Because he believes who? The teacher. No, he says that. And I said, "Well, Dad, you got to go to school." He told me. He says, "If I go up to that school and I find out you're lying, I'm going to kick your blank." That's what he told me. He said, "I have not taken day off work, and you better tell him, this better be legit." And I said, "Well, I'm telling you it is." And he didn't believe me. I'm telling you.